Madison Lynn was 36 years old and invisible at least. That's how it felt working as a radar technician aboard the USS Valor. Every morning, she'd tie her dark brown hair into the same regulation bun, slip on her technical uniform, and disappear into the lower deck cabins where nobody bothered to look. The aircraft carrier was a floating city of 4,000 souls, but Madison might as well have been a ghost. She spent her days in cramped quarters filled with humming computers, monitoring screens that painted green dots across digital oceans, logging data that kept everyone else alive. The work was crucial. One missed reading could mean disaster, but to her colleagues, she was just another piece of equipment. "Hey, Benchwarmer Barbie." The voice belonged to Petty Officer Stevens, a 22-year-old hotshot who thought his muscles were more impressive than his brain. He strutted through the technical bay with his usual swagger, flanked by two junior officers who hung on his every word like gospel. "That tech outfit really suits a bench-riding doll like you," Stevens continued, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. The nickname had stuck for months now, Benchwarmer Barbie, because she sat at her station all day, because she was quiet, because she was a woman in a man's world who dared to look, well, like a woman. Madison smiled softly and said nothing. She never did. Instead, she returned to her work, checking radar signatures, calibrating instruments, making sure the ship's electronic eyes could see threats before they became disasters. What her colleagues didn't know was that Madison Lynn had once been more than a technician. Years ago, she'd been a trainee in the Navy's elite Steel Storm pilot program. She'd flown simulators, mastered aerodynamics, dreamed of touching the clouds. But after a training accident that wasn't her fault, a mechanical failure during a routine exercise, she'd been quietly reassigned, grounded forever. So she'd chosen to study something else, something they thought didn't matter. Launch systems, emergency protocols, the complex networks of computers and missiles that could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. The technical briefing room was sterile and cold, like most spaces on the carrier. Lieutenant Rodriguez stood at the front, clicking through slides of system diagnostics while the assembled technicians pretended to pay attention. Madison sat in the back, as always, her notebook filled with detailed observations and potential improvements. "Madison," Rodriguez had said during a technical briefing last month, his tone dismissive, "your proposal to modify the secondary launch startup sequence is interesting, but maybe stick to what you know, okay? This isn't some water gun you're trying to fix. This is military-grade equipment, not Barbie's playtime." The room had erupted in laughter. Madison had simply nodded, collected her papers, and walked away. But she kept working on the modifications. Anyway, late at night when everyone else was asleep, she'd run simulations, test scenarios, perfect the code that could save lives. Because Madison Lynn understood something her colleagues didn't. Being underestimated was sometimes the greatest weapon of all. The warning signs had been there from the beginning. Commander Harrison ran the technical division with an iron fist and an obvious bias. He promoted the loudest voices, not the smartest ones. He valued bravado over precision, showmanship over substance. And he had a particular talent for making Madison feel like she didn't belong. During her first week aboard the Valor, she'd submitted a detailed report on potential improvements to the radar array sensitivity settings. Harrison had glanced at it for exactly 30 seconds before tossing it into his trash can. "We don't need suggestions from the new girl," he'd said to his assembled staff. "We need compliance." That should have been her first clue. But Madison had believed in the system, believed that good work would speak for itself. She'd been naive then, still thinking that merit mattered more than politics. Now, 6 months later, she knew better. The USS Valor wasn't just a warship, it was a boys' club with weapons, and she was the outsider they'd never accept. But something was building beneath the surface. a storm she could feel in her bones. The ship was heading toward dangerous waters, both literally and figuratively, and Madison had the sinking feeling that soon, being invisible might not be enough to protect her. As she walked back to her quarters that evening, passing groups of officers who fell silent when she approached, Madison made a decision. She wouldn't just survive her tour of duty. She'd be ready for whatever came next. Even if it meant working in the shadows, even if it meant breaking rules she'd sworn to uphold. Because somewhere out there in the vast ocean, lives were depending on systems that weren't as perfect as everyone believed. And when the time came, and Madison knew it would come, she'd be the only one who could make the difference between rescue and tragedy. The simulation room was Madison's personal hell. 3 weeks ago, during a routine emergency launch drill, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The rescue missile had failed to deploy. The targeting system had crashed, and the entire exercise had been declared a disaster. Technician Lynn, Commander Harrison had said, his voice cold as Arctic wind, "Your data input caused this malfunction. Because of your error, we're looking at a complete system review and potential safety violations." It hadn't been her error. Madison knew it, had tried to explain it, had shown them the logs proving the fault lay in the primary circuit board. But when you're Benchwarmer Barbie, nobody listens to your technical explanations. They just see a woman who must have pressed the wrong button. Her security clearance had been downgraded, her access to critical systems revoked, her reputation, whatever. Little she had destroyed. The worst part wasn't just the professional humiliation. It was watching the real problem go unfixed while everyone congratulated themselves on finding a scapegoat. "Madison, you need to understand something," Lieutenant Rodriguez had pulled her aside after the disciplinary meeting. His voice was quieter now, almost sympathetic. "This isn't personal. But when something goes wrong, someone has to take responsibility. Better it's you than the whole department. Better it's you." The words had echoed in her head for weeks. Not better to find the real problem. Not better to prevent it from happening again. Just better to sacrifice the quiet woman who couldn't fight back effectively. Stevens and his crew made sure she never forgot her place. They'd walk past her workstation and make exaggerated beeping sounds like a malfunctioning computer. They'd leave printouts of basic technical manuals on her desk with sticky notes saying remedial reading for Barbie. The harassment was constant, but never quite crossing the line into something she could formally report. "You know what your problem is?" Stevens had cornered her in the supply closet last week, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're smarter than everyone else. But smart girls who don't know their place, they don't last long on ships like this." Madison had tried to push past him, but he blocked her path. "I'm just trying to do my job," she'd said quietly. "Your job is to sit down, shut up, and follow orders. Think you can handle that, Barbie?" She'd nodded, hating herself for it, and he'd finally stepped aside. But the message was clear. Stay in your lane or things would get worse. Even Jenna Martinez, her only real friend aboard the Valor, had started keeping her distance. Jenna was a signals engineer, smart, ambitious, with everything to lose by associating with the ship's technical pariah. "Mad," Jenna had said carefully over coffee that morning, avoiding eye contact. "Sometimes it's better to keep your head down, you know? Just survive until your tour ends. Survive. Not thrive. Not contribute. Just survive." The isolation was suffocating. Madison found herself eating alone, working alone, spending her off hours walking the deck by herself, while groups of sailors laughed and joked just out of earshot. She'd become a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you try to rise above your station. But late at night, when the ship was quiet and the only sounds were the endless hum of engines and the whisper of waves against the hull, Madison pulled out her personal tablet and continued her real work. The launch system modifications weren't just theoretical anymore. They were her lifeline, her proof that she belonged here, that she had value beyond what these men were willing to acknowledge. She'd identified 17 critical vulnerabilities in the current system, developed patches for 12 of them, and created entirely new protocols that could cut emergency response times by 40%. The work was brilliant, revolutionary, but it was also completely unauthorized. If Harrison discovered what she was doing, it would mean court-martial for sure. The irony wasn't lost on her. They'd stripped her of legitimate access to the system she was trying to improve, forcing her to work in the shadows like some kind of digital outlaw. But Madison had learned something important during her pilot training. Sometimes you had to break the rules to save lives. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Madison quickly closed her tablet and opened the door to find Petty Officer Williams standing in the hallway. Williams was older than most of the crew, a quiet man who kept to himself and actually seemed to see Madison as a person rather than a target. "Heard what happened in the simulation," he said quietly. "That wasn't your fault, Lynn. Anyone with half a brain could see that." It was the first acknowledgement she'd received that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't going crazy. "Thanks," she whispered, not trusting her voice to stay steady. "Watch yourself," Williams added, glancing down the hallway. "Harrison's got it out for you, and Stevens is his attack dog. This isn't over." As he walked away, Madison felt a chill run down her spine. She was being targeted, systematically destroyed by men who saw her as a threat to their carefully constructed hierarchy. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated just how dangerous a cornered genius could become. The new rules appeared on Madison's desk like a death sentence wrapped in official Navy letterhead. Additional security protocols for Technician Lynn. The memo read, signed by Commander Harrison himself. She was now required to have her work reviewed daily, submit hourly progress reports, and obtain written authorization for any system access beyond basic monitoring. "Congratulations, Barbie," Stephen smirked as he leaned against her workstation. "Looks like you're getting the VIP treatment. Very incompetent person treatment." His cronies laughed on cue, but Madison noticed something different in their eyes' uncertainty. The harassment was escalating too quickly, becoming too obvious. Even in the Navy's boys' club, there were limits to what could be done openly. Madison's work efficiency plummeted under the new restrictions. Simple tasks that once took minutes now required forms, approvals, and reviews. She spent more time documenting her actions than actually performing them. It was bureaucratic strangulation, designed to make her job impossible and force her to quit. During the morning briefing, Harrison made his intentions crystal clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to address recent security concerns. When personnel demonstrate repeated failures and poor judgment, we must take protective measures. These aren't punishments. They're safeguards to prevent future incidents that could endanger lives." Everyone knew he was talking about Madison, though he never said her name. She sat in the back row, feeling dozens of eyes on her, marking her as the problem that needed solving. The message was unmistakable: conform or be destroyed. But resistance came from an unexpected source. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson, the ship's most senior technical advisor, approached Madison after the briefing. Thompson was Old Navy, a weathered man with 25 years of carrier experience who commanded respect from everyone, including Harrison. "Lynn," he said quietly, "walk with me." They made their way to the observation deck, where the endless ocean stretched to the horizon. Thompson lit a cigarette, a privilege of rank that few questioned. "I've been watching this situation develop," he said, exhaling smoke into the salt air. "Harrison's overplaying his hand. These restrictions? They're not standard protocol. He's improvising." Madison felt a flicker of hope. "Sir, I didn't cause that simulation failure." "The primary circuit board." "I know," Thompson interrupted. I pulled the real logs after the incident. Board failure. Clear as day. Question is, why didn't Harrison want to see them? The implication hung in the air like Thompson's cigarette smoke. Madison had been sacrificed, not because she'd made a mistake, but because admitting the truth would have required acknowledging systemic problems that Harrison didn't want to fix. There's going to be an inspection next week, Thompson continued. Pentagon brass, full technical review. Harrison's nervous about it, which means he's going to double down on making you the scapegoat. But it also means there might be opportunities. What kind of opportunities? Thompson dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. The kind that requires someone with balls big enough to stand up when it matters. You still got those. Lynn? That evening, Madison received an encrypted message on her personal device. The sender was anonymous, but the content was explosive. Detailed maintenance records showing that the launch system failures weren't isolated incidents. There had been 6 similar malfunctions in the past year, all covered up, all blamed on operator error. Someone else on the ship knew the truth. Someone with access to classified records was quietly building a case. Madison wasn't as alone as she'd thought. She spent the night cross-referencing the leaked data with her own observations. The pattern was damning. Every failure occurred in systems that Harrison's department was responsible for maintaining. The commander hadn't just scapegoated her. He'd been systematically covering up his own incompetence for months. The next morning brought fresh humiliation. Madison arrived at her workstation to find it had been relocated to a storage closet, barely large enough for her chair and monitor. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Barbie's Dream Workplace. New accommodations suit you better." Stevens called out as she squeezed into the cramped space. Now you can play pretend without bothering the real technicians. But Madison had learned something crucial from her pilot training. When enemy fire is getting closer, you don't retreat, you go on the offensive. She began documenting everything. Every harassment incident, every unreasonable restriction, every moment when proper protocol was ignored in favor of personal vendettas. More importantly, she'd identified the ship's true vulnerability. The upcoming Pentagon inspection would include a full review of emergency response systems. If something went wrong during the inspection, if the very systems Harrison was desperate to hide malfunctioned in front of military brass, his career would be over. Madison began working on more than just system improvements. She was preparing for war, and her enemies had no idea what was coming. They'd pushed the quiet technician too far, backed her into a corner where her only choice was to fight back with everything she had. The inspection was 5 days away. 5 days to gather evidence, build alliances, and prepare for the moment when Benchwarmer Barbie would finally show them what she was really capable of. They wanted her to be invisible, but sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones you couldn't see coming. The alert came at 0347 hours, screaming through the ship's communication system like a banshee. Madison jolted awake in her cramped quarters, instantly alert as her training kicked in. Emergency situations were what she'd been preparing for her entire career, even if nobody wanted to admit it. All hands, all hands. We have aircraft in distress. Repeat, aircraft in distress. She threw on her uniform and raced toward the emergency command center, her heart pounding against her ribs. Through the nearest porthole, she could see the organized chaos of emergency response floodlights sweeping the dark ocean as a lone F-18 Hornet struggled to approach the carrier's landing deck. The pilot was fighting crosswinds, his aircraft wobbling dangerously in the night sky. Madison recognized the tail number. Lieutenant Ethan Mars, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots. If he was having trouble, the situation was desperate. Then came the radio transmission that made everyone's blood freeze. Mayday, mayday. Engine failure. I'm going down. Mars's voice was steady despite the terror he must have felt. His fighter jet disappeared from radar 2.5 nautical miles from the ship, swallowed by black water and darkness. Madison burst into the emergency command center to find pure chaos. Officers shouted conflicting orders, while technicians frantically worked their stations. The scene that unfolded before her was her worst nightmare made real. The primary launch system is down for maintenance. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez shouted into his headset. We can't deploy rescue missiles. What about secondary launch? Someone called out. Secondary requires level 7 authorization. We don't have anyone with that clearance on duty. Madison's blood turned to ice. The secondary launch system, the one she'd been secretly upgrading, the one she'd perfected through months of unauthorized late-night work, was their only hope. But activating it would require her old access codes from her pilot training days, codes she technically still possessed, but was absolutely forbidden to use. Commander Harrison stood in the center of the chaos, his face red with stress and barely controlled panic. This was his worst nightmare, a real emergency that would expose every shortcut, every cover-up, every system failure he'd been hiding. Options, he barked. I need options now. Sir, Madison said, stepping forward despite every instinct telling her to stay invisible. I can activate the secondary system. Harrison spun around, his face contorting with disbelief and rage. Technician Lin, this is not the time for your... There's a pilot dying out there. Madison's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Every second we waste arguing is a second closer to losing him. She didn't wait for permission. Madison pushed past the commander and reached for the secondary launch console, her fingers finding the emergency panel override. This was it, the moment that would either save a life or destroy her career completely. Stop, you don't have clearance for that system. Rodriguez grabbed her arm, but Madison shook him off and kept typing. The authorization codes she'd memorized years ago flowed from her fingers like muscle memory. The screen flickered, displaying warnings and security prompts that would have terrified anyone else. But Madison had been living with fear for months. Fear of harassment, fear of failure, fear of being broken by men who wanted her gone. If you're wrong about this, Harrison hissed behind her. If this fails, you'll face court-martial. If I don't try, Madison replied without turning around. Lieutenant, Mars will face death. The console came alive with green lights. System status, active. Launch authorization, confirmed. Target coordinates, acquired. Madison's hands moved across the controls like she'd been born for this moment. She programmed the rescue missiles. Trajectory, factored in wind speed and ocean currents, and calculated the optimal deployment pattern for the emergency beacon system. Every modification she'd made in secret, every improvement she'd developed in the shadows, was about to be tested under the most critical circumstances imaginable. Launch sequence initiated, the computer announced. Through the porthole, they watched a streak of light arc across the dark sky. The rescue missile deployed its payload exactly where Madison had calculated, a floating beacon system with emergency supplies and a signal transmitter strong enough to guide rescue helicopters through the night. For 7 agonizing minutes, the command center held its breath. Madison stood frozen at the console, running continuous system diagnostics, making sure everything was performing within acceptable parameters. Our modifications were working perfectly, but would they be enough? Then Petty Officer Davis's voice crackled over the radio. Contact! We have contact. Pilot located and conscious. Rescue helicopter inbound. The room erupted in cheers, but Madison barely heard them. She was already documenting the launch sequence, preparing for whatever questions would come next. Because she knew this wasn't over, it was just beginning. 23 minutes later, Lieutenant Ethan Mars was pulled from the frigid Atlantic Ocean, hypothermic but alive. The rescue missile Madison had launched had saved his life, and everyone on the ship knew it. As the medical team rushed Mars to the ship's hospital, Madison quietly logged off the secondary launch system and walked back to her quarters. She'd broken every rule in the book, used unauthorized access codes, and implemented unapproved system modifications. Tomorrow there would be consequences, questions, possibly punishment. But tonight, a fellow serviceman was alive because Benchwarmer Barbie had refused to sit quietly on the sidelines. And for the first time in months, Madison Lynn felt like she remembered who she really was. The technical bay was eerily quiet when Madison returned the next morning. No jokes, no nicknames, no laughter at her expense. Her colleagues worked at their stations with unusual focus, stealing glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Word had spread through the ship faster than bad weather. The woman they'd mocked had saved a pilot's life. Madison tried to focus on routine maintenance tasks, but her mind kept replaying the previous night's events. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, used code she wasn't authorized to possess, activated systems she'd been explicitly banned from touching. The fact that it had worked, that Mars was alive, wouldn't necessarily protect her from the consequences. At 1100 hours, she was summoned to Commander Harrison's office. The walk through the ship's corridors felt like a death march, with crew members stepping aside to let her pass, their expressions unreadable. Some looked at her with something that might have been respect. Others seemed to be watching a condemned woman walking to her execution. Harrison's office was spartanly decorated with regulation furniture and a few personal photos showing him with various military officials. He sat behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Sit down, Technician Lynn." Madison remained standing. "Sir, I'd prefer to—" I said sit down. Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The regulations you violated? The chain of command you've completely obliterated? I saved Lieutenant Mars's life, sir. You used unauthorized access codes. You activated systems without proper clearance. You could have caused a catastrophic malfunction but I didn't." Madison's voice was steady, calmer than she felt. The systems worked perfectly. The rescue was successful. A serviceman is alive because someone acted when action was needed. Harrison leaned forward, his eyes cold. "Don't you dare try to justify what you did. There are procedures, protocols, chains of command that exist for good reasons. You don't get to decide when to ignore them because you think you know better." The irony was staggering. This from a man who'd been ignoring safety protocols for months, covering up system failures, and creating his own rules to protect his career. But Madison had learned something crucial during her pilot training. Never reveal your full hand until you're ready to play it. "What happens now, sir?" Now I recommend you for court-martial. Unauthorized system access, violation of security protocols, insubordination, take your pick. You're confined to quarters pending formal investigation. As Madison stood to leave, Harrison added one final insult. "And Lynn, that little stunt last night doesn't make you a hero. It makes you a liability who got lucky." But Harrison's confidence was cracking, and Madison could see it. The man who terrorized her for months was scared, and scared men made mistakes. The Pentagon inspection was still 3 days away, and word of the rescue was already spreading beyond the ship. Military brass would want details, explanations, full technical reports on how the secondary launch system had performed so flawlessly. Back in her quarters, Madison found a message waiting on her personal device. It was from the same anonymous source who'd sent her the maintenance records. But this time, the content was even more explosive. Harrison had been ordered to submit a complete technical analysis of the rescue operation to Pentagon officials. He needed someone who actually understood the systems to write the report, but he just placed the only qualified person under house arrest. The message included an attachment security footage from the command center showing Madison's actions during the emergency. Her movements were precise, professional, completely confident. She looked like exactly what she was, an expert operating at the peak of her abilities under extreme pressure. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Madison opened the door to find Chief Warrant Officer Thompson standing in the hallway, holding a steaming cup of coffee and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mind if I come in? We need to talk." Thompson settled into the room's only chair while Madison perched on her narrow bunk. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Thompson began what would become the most important conversation of Madison's military career. 25 years I've been on carriers," he said quietly. "I've seen heroes and cowards, competent officers and dangerous idiots. Last night, I watched you operate that launch system like you designed it yourself." Madison said nothing, but Thompson caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Steel Storm Program, class of 2018, he continued. "Under Captain Carter. Only the top 1% of naval aviators even get invited to try out. Graduation rate under 5%. You were there for 8 months before the training accident grounded you. How did you? I served under Carter for 3 years. He still talks about you sometimes. Says you were one of the most naturally gifted pilots he'd ever trained. Lynn had hands like silk and a brain like a computer. That's how he put it." The revelation hit Madison like a physical blow. All these months of being treated like an incompetent, of being mocked and marginalized, and Thompson had known all along who she really was. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Thompson's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Because sometimes people need to prove themselves on their own terms. And because I had a feeling that when the time came, you'd remind everyone exactly who they were dealing with." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device Madison recognized as a secure communication unit. "The Pentagon inspection team lands tomorrow morning. Admiral Richardson himself is leading it. They're going to want a full technical briefing on the rescue operation, including detailed analysis of the secondary launch system modifications." Madison's heart started racing. This was the opportunity Thompson had hinted at, the chance to show her work to people who would actually understand and appreciate it. "Harrison can't write that report," Thompson continued. "He doesn't understand the systems well enough. He's going to need help, but he just placed his only qualified technical expert under arrest. It's what we call a tactical error." The secure comm unit beeped softly. Thompson glanced at it and nodded. "That's Admiral Richardson's office. They want to speak with whoever conducted the successful rescue launch. Seems Lieutenant Mars has been very vocal about the quality of the emergency response." Madison felt the tide beginning to turn. For months, she'd been fighting a defensive battle, trying to survive in an environment designed to crush her. But now, with the right allies and the right opportunity, she could go on the offensive. "What do you need me to do?" Thompson stood up, leaving the comm unit on her small desk. "Write the report, Lynn. Write it properly, with all the technical details they'll need. Show them what you've really been working on. And when they ask you questions, and they will ask you questions, you tell them the truth about everything." As he reached the door, Thompson paused. "One more thing. Harrison's been covering up system failures for months, blaming them on operator error. But operator error doesn't explain the pattern of malfunctions, does it?" Madison shook her head. "The failures were all hardware-related. Primary circuit boards, outdated software protocols, inadequate maintenance schedules. I documented everything." "Good, because tomorrow you're going to get the chance to present that documentation to people who matter. People who care more about operational effectiveness than protecting incompetent commanders." After Thompson left, Madison stared at the COMM unit for a long moment. Then she opened her laptop and began typing the most important report of her career. Every modification she'd made, every improvement she'd developed, every system vulnerability she'd identified, it was all going into the official record. Benchwarmer Barbie was about to become a very different kind of problem for Commander Harrison. The kind that ended careers and changed everything. Admiral Richardson was not what Madison had expected. The Pentagon's top technical inspector was a compact woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She arrived aboard the USS Valor with a team of specialists who immediately began conducting the most thorough system review the ship had ever seen. Madison was escorted to the briefing room under guard, still technically under arrest, but required to provide technical testimony. The irony wasn't lost on her. Harrison needed her expertise to avoid a career-ending scandal, but he'd made sure she understood her place in the hierarchy. The briefing room was packed with senior officers, Pentagon officials, and technical specialists. Madison took her assigned seat in the back, noting how Harrison positioned himself at the head of the table like he was in charge of the proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Richardson began, "we're here to conduct a formal review of the emergency rescue operation that saved Lieutenant Mars 3 nights ago. I understand the secondary launch system performed flawlessly under extreme conditions, which is particularly noteworthy given the system's complexity." Harrison cleared his throat. "Admiral, I believe the success reflects the high training standards we maintain in my technical division. Our people are prepared for any emergency." Madison bit her tongue so hard she tasted blood. Harrison was already trying to take credit for her work, positioning the rescue as a victory for his leadership rather than an unauthorized action by a subordinate he'd been systematically destroying. "Commander Harrison," Admiral Richardson continued, "I'd like to review the technical specifications for the launch sequence. The preliminary report mentions several modifications to standard protocols. Can you walk us through those changes?" The color drained from Harrison's face. He shuffled through his papers like he was looking for something that didn't exist. "Well, Admiral, the modifications were standard optimization procedures, routine efficiency improvements." "I see. And these routine improvements, who designed them?" Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Madison watched him realize he was trapped. He couldn't admit he didn't understand the modifications without revealing his incompetence. But he couldn't claim credit for work he hadn't done when the real designer was sitting 20 feet away. "The modifications were developed by my team," he said finally. "Collaborative effort." Admiral Richardson made a note on her tablet. "I'd like to speak with the primary developer." "Who should I be talking to?" Another pause. Harrison looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. "That would be..." Technician Lin handled much of the technical implementation. Every eye in the room turned to Madison. She stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was it, the chance Thompson had promised, the opportunity to tell her story to people who would understand its significance. "Technician Lin," Admiral Richardson said, "please walk us through the modifications you made to the secondary launch system." For the next 45 minutes, Madison provided the most detailed technical briefing of her career. She explained every modification, every improvement, every line of code she'd written during those late-night sessions. She showed them the vulnerability assessments, the performance optimizations, the safety protocols she'd developed that went far beyond standard military requirements. The Pentagon team asked increasingly sophisticated questions, and Madison answered every one with precision and confidence. She wasn't just explaining her work. She was demonstrating a level of technical mastery that impressed even the most senior officials in the room. "These modifications," Admiral Richardson said slowly, "they're extraordinary. The efficiency improvements alone would revolutionize our emergency response capabilities across the entire fleet. How long did this development take? Approximately 8 months, ma'am. I worked on it during off-duty hours. Off-duty hours? This wasn't part of your assigned responsibilities? Madison felt the room's attention sharpen. This was the moment of truth. No, ma'am. I developed the modifications independently, without authorization. A murmur rippled through the assembled officers. Unauthorized system modifications were serious violations, but the quality of Madison's work made the situation complex. She'd broken rules to create something that could save countless lives. Commander Harrison, Admiral Richardson's voice, had acquired an edge. Were you aware that? Technician Lin was conducting unauthorized modifications to critical ship systems. Harrison looked like he wanted to disappear. There were reports of irregular activity, but did you investigate these reports? We were focused on more pressing operational concerns. Admiral Richardson's expression suggested she found that answer inadequate. She made another note on her tablet, then turned back to Madison. Technician Lin, I understand you were recently disciplined for a system malfunction during emergency drills. Can you explain what happened? This was the moment Madison had been preparing for. She pulled out her documentation system logs, maintenance records, diagnostic reports that proved beyond doubt that the malfunction had been caused by hardware failure, not operator error. Ma'am, the failure was caused by a defective primary circuit board. I identified the problem immediately and submitted a detailed report, but my analysis was dismissed. I was blamed for the malfunction to avoid acknowledging systemic maintenance issues. She handed her evidence to Admiral Richardson, who reviewed it with the intense focus of someone who understood exactly what she was reading. The silence in the room became oppressive as the implications became clear. Commander Harrison, Admiral Richardson said, without looking up from the reports, it appears Technician Lin was scapegoated for equipment failures that were not her fault. Were you aware that the real cause of the malfunction was never addressed? Harrison was sweating now, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under scrutiny. Admiral, in the heat of operational pressures, sometimes you blame subordinates for your department's failures? The question hung in the air like a blade. Madison watched Harrison's career implode in real time, knowing that everything was about to change. The men who tormented her, who tried to destroy her spirit and drive her away, were about to face the consequences of their actions. But Admiral Richardson wasn't finished. She turned to address the room with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a clear case of exceptional technical competence being suppressed by inadequate leadership. Technician Lin has developed innovations that could transform our emergency response capabilities. But instead of being recognized and supported, she's been marginalized and disciplined. She looked directly at Madison. Technician Lin, I'm ordering an immediate review of your security clearance and duty assignments. This ship needs to make better use of your capabilities. Then she turned to Harrison, and her voice became cold. As Winter, Commander, we'll be conducting a comprehensive review of your department's operations, including all recent equipment failures and personnel actions. I suggest you prepare detailed explanations for every decision you've made regarding Technician Lin's assignments and evaluations. Harrison's face had gone ashen. The man who'd wielded absolute power over Madison's career just hours earlier now looked like he might be sick. Yes, ma'am. Of course, Admiral. As the briefing concluded, Madison felt a strange mix of vindication and uncertainty. She'd won this battle, but she knew the war was far from over. Harrison still had allies. Stevens still had his crew of supporters, and military bureaucracy moved slowly, even when justice was obvious. But something fundamental had shifted. As she walked through the ship's corridors, Madison noticed a difference immediately. Sailors who'd previously ignored her now nodded respectfully. Officers who dismissed her made eye contact. The woman they'd called Benchwarmer Barbie had just demonstrated her true capabilities to the most senior military officials in the Navy. Stevens was waiting for her outside her quarters, his usual swagger replaced by nervous energy. "Look, Lynn," he said, quietly, "maybe we got off on the wrong foot. You know how it is, just shipboard humor, nothing personal." Madison studied his face, seeing the fear beneath his attempt at reconciliation. News of the Pentagon review had spread quickly, and everyone knew which way the wind was blowing. "Nothing personal," she repeated. "Like when you blocked me in the supply closet and told me smart girls don't last long on ships like this?" Stevens's face flushed red. "I never said—" "Petty Officer Stevens," Madison interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "I suggest you focus on your own performance evaluations. I have a feeling they're going to receive very close scrutiny in the coming weeks." As Stevens hurried away, Madison realized she was no longer the hunted. The dynamics had shifted completely, and now her tormentors were the ones looking over their shoulders, wondering what consequences their actions might bring. The formal hearing convened 3 days later in the ship's main conference room. Admiral Richardson had assembled a full investigative panel, including representatives from Naval Personnel Command, the Inspector General's Office, and Technical Systems Command. Madison had never seen so much brass gathered in one place. "Commander." Harrison sat at the defendant's table with a Navy lawyer at his side, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in a week. The evidence against him had mounted steadily. Falsified maintenance reports, suppressed system failure analyses, and a documented pattern of retaliatory actions against subordinates who questioned his decisions. Madison was called as the primary witness. As she took her seat at the witness table, she caught sight of Lieutenant Ethan Mars in the gallery. He'd insisted on attending despite still recovering from his ordeal, wanting to see justice done for the woman who'd saved his life. "Technician Lynn," Admiral Richardson began, "please state for the record your qualifications and background." This was the moment Madison had been waiting for, the chance to tell her complete story to people who would understand its significance. "Ma'am, I'm a graduate of the Naval Academy, class of 2016. I was selected for the Steel Storm Advanced Pilot Program under Captain Carter, where I completed 8 months of training before being medically grounded following a training accident." A murmur went through the room. Steel Storm was legendary. Only the Navy's most elite aviators even qualified for consideration. "After being grounded, I chose to remain in service and was assigned to technical systems. I hold advanced certifications in radar operations, launch system maintenance, and emergency protocols. I've also completed graduate-level coursework in computer systems engineering and aerospace technology." Harrison's lawyer looked like he wanted to object, but Admiral Richardson's expression made it clear that interruptions wouldn't be tolerated. "Prior to the incident that damaged my reputation," Madison continued, "I had submitted numerous reports identifying critical vulnerabilities in our launch systems. These reports were dismissed without investigation. When I continued working on solutions during my personal time, I was told to stick to what I know and stop trying to fix military-grade equipment." She pulled out her documentation months of meticulous records showing every interaction, every dismissal, every instance of harassment and retaliation. The picture that emerged was damning. A brilliant technical expert systematically destroyed by a commander who felt threatened by her competence. "The night Lieutenant Mars went down," Madison said, her voice steady, "I faced a choice. I could follow protocol and watch a fellow serviceman die, or I could use my knowledge and training to save his life. I chose to act." Admiral Richardson leaned forward. "Technician Lynn, you used access codes from your pilot training that were technically still active but not authorized for your current position. You modified critical systems without approval. You violated multiple regulations. How do you justify these actions?" Madison met her gaze directly. "Ma'am, I swore an oath to protect and defend. Sometimes fulfilling that oath requires choosing between following rules and saving lives. I'd make the same choice again without hesitation." The room fell silent. Then Lieutenant Mars stood up in the gallery. "Permission to speak, Admiral?" Admiral Richardson nodded. "Ma'am, Technician Lin didn't just save my life. She executed the most precise emergency rescue I've ever seen. Every calculation was perfect. Every decision was exactly right. She operated that system like she'd designed it herself, because she had designed it herself. If that's not what we want in our technical personnel, I don't know what is." The impact of Mars's testimony was immediate and obvious. Here was a decorated pilot, nearly killed in service to his country, vouching for the woman who'd refused to let him die. Commander Harrison's defense crumbled quickly under cross-examination. Faced with documented evidence of his incompetence and retaliation, he could only offer weak explanations and shifting blame. His lawyer's attempts to portray Madison's actions as reckless insubordination fell flat against the overwhelming evidence of her competence and integrity. The most damaging moment came when Admiral Richardson presented Harrison with the maintenance records that Madison's anonymous ally had leaked. "Commander, these documents show 6 instances of system failures in your department over the past year. All were blamed on operator error. All were actually caused by equipment defects that went unaddressed. Can you explain this pattern?" Harrison's face went white. "Admiral, we were operating under resource constraints. Sometimes difficult decisions. Difficult decisions like scapegoating your most qualified technician to cover up your departments. Failures?" The question hung in the air like a verdict. Harrison had no answer because there was no answer. He'd sacrificed Madison's career to protect his own, and now the evidence was undeniable. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson was called to testify about Madison's true qualifications and the culture of harassment she'd endured. His testimony was devastating in its quiet authority. "Admiral," Thompson said, "in 25 years of naval service, I've rarely encountered someone with Technician Lin's combination of technical skill and dedication. What happened to her aboard this ship is a disgrace to the uniform we all wear." The hearing concluded with Admiral Richardson's summary, delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. This panel finds that Technician Lin acted with exceptional competence under extreme circumstances to save the life of a fellow serviceman. Her modifications to the launch system represent innovations that will be implemented fleet-wide. Her treatment by Commander Harrison constitutes a clear pattern of retaliation and abuse of authority. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Effective immediately, Technician Lin is promoted to Chief Petty Officer and assigned as Lead Launch System Specialist for this vessel. Commander Harrison is relieved of duty pending further investigation. The culture of harassment and incompetence that allowed this situation to develop will not be tolerated in the United States Navy. As the gavel fell, Madison felt a wave of emotions she'd been suppressing for months. Relief, vindication, and something that felt almost like peace. The nightmare was over, and justice had finally been served. Benchwarmer Barbie had become Chief Petty Officer Lin, and everyone who doubted her was about to learn exactly what they'd lost. 6 months later, Madison stood on the USS Valor's command bridge as the ship's newly appointed Senior Launch Systems Coordinator. The view from the bridge was different from her old station in the technical bay, literally and figuratively. She could see the entire flight deck, watch the intricate dance of aircraft operations, and know that the systems keeping everyone safe were running better than they ever had. The changes had been swift and comprehensive. Madison's modifications The launch systems had been implemented across the entire fleet after rigorous testing confirmed their effectiveness. Emergency response times had improved by an average of 43%, and system reliability had increased dramatically. The Navy had even created a new technical classification based on her innovations. Chief Lynn, Captain Rodriguez, called from his position at the center of the bridge. Pentagon's on the line. They want an update on the Mark 7 upgrade implementation. Rodriguez was Harrison's replacement, a competent officer who'd made it clear from day one that he valued expertise over politics. The contrast was remarkable. Where Harrison had seen Madison as a threat, Rodriguez saw her as an invaluable asset. "Tell them we're ahead of schedule, sir," Madison replied. "The new systems are performing at 97% efficiency, well above projected parameters." As she spoke, she caught sight of her reflection in the bridge windows. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who'd been called Benchwarmer Barbie just months earlier. She carried herself with confidence now, spoke with authority, and commanded the respect she'd always deserved but never received. The harassment had stopped completely. Stevens had been transferred to a shore posting after his role in the intimidation campaign came to light during the investigation. His cronies had scattered to other assignments, apparently deciding that association with Madison's former tormentors wasn't good for their careers. "Chief Lynn?" The voice belonged to Petty Officer Williams, the older sailor who'd been one of the first to show her kindness during the dark months. "Lieutenant Mars is requesting permission to come aboard. Says he wants to thank you personally for the system upgrades." Madison smiled. Mars had become something of a celebrity afterward, of his rescue spread through the fleet. But more importantly, he'd become a vocal advocate for technical innovation and fair treatment of all personnel, regardless of gender or rank. "Send him up to the bridge," Madison said. "I'd like him to see how the new systems are performing." As Williams hurried away, Madison reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The Steel Storm program had taught her to fly, but the USS Valor had taught her something equally valuable, that sometimes you had to crash before you could truly soar. Her personal tablet chimed with an incoming message. It was from Captain Carter, her old instructor from the pilot program. The message was brief but meaningful. "Heard about your innovations and promotion. Always knew you were destined for great things, even if the path wasn't what we expected. Proud of you, Lynn." The words meant more to Madison than any official commendation. Carter had believed in her potential when she was just a trainee with big dreams, and he'd continued believing even after the accident that changed everything. Lieutenant Mars arrived on the bridge 20 minutes later, looking healthier than he had since his rescue. His recovery had been complete, and he'd already returned to flight status. "Chief Lynn," he said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "I wanted to see the improvements you've made firsthand. The talk around the fleet is that these systems are revolutionary." Madison led him to the main technical display, where real-time data showed the performance of every system she'd upgraded. The key was integrating the targeting algorithms with predictive modeling, she explained. "Instead of reacting to emergencies, we can now anticipate and prepare for them." Mars studied the displays with the appreciation of someone who understood what the numbers meant in life-or-death situations. "This is incredible work, Chief. You've probably saved hundreds of lives that haven't even been threatened yet." They were interrupted by Chief Warrant Officer Thompson, who approached with a formal envelope in his hand. "Chief Lynn, this just came in from Naval Systems Command. Looks official." Madison opened the envelope and read the contents twice before the meaning fully registered. It was an assignment order, not a transfer, but a promotion to Naval Systems Command itself, with a mandate to lead a fleet-wide initiative implementing her innovations across all carrier groups. "They want me in Washington," she said, barely believing the words. to head the new Emergency Systems Development Division. Thompson grinned, the expression transforming his weathered face, from benchwarmer to division head. That's got to be some kind of record. As news of Madison's promotion spread through the ship, a crowd began gathering on the bridge. Sailors and officers who'd witnessed her transformation wanted to offer congratulations and show their respect. Even Captain Rodriguez took time to shake her hand and express his appreciation for her service. "Chief Lin," he said formally, "the Vomb. USS Valor has been honored to have you aboard. Your innovations will protect sailors for generations to come." That evening, Madison stood alone on the carrier's deck, watching the sun set over the endless ocean. The same water that had nearly claimed Lieutenant Mars's life now reflected golden light, peaceful and beautiful. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for her new assignment, leaving the ship where she'd endured so much and accomplished even more. Jenna Martinez appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Her former friend had gradually rebuilt their relationship as Madison's Vindication became undeniable. "Penny for your thoughts?" Jenna asked, offering one of the cups. Madison accepted the coffee gratefully. "Just thinking about how strange life is. 6 months ago, I was invisible. Nobody listened to me. Nobody valued my work. Nobody saw my potential. I was just Benchwarmer Barbie, taking up space and making mistakes. And now? Now I'm going to Washington to revolutionize naval emergency systems for the entire fleet. It doesn't feel real." Jenna was quiet for a moment, watching dolphins race alongside the ship. "You know what I think? I think you were never invisible. You were just surrounded by people who were too blind to see what was right in front of them." Madison smiled, remembering the months of isolation and doubt that had nearly broken her. "Spirit, maybe. But I learned something important during all of this. Being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. Sometimes it's the greatest advantage of all." "How so?" "Because when people don't expect much from you, they don't see you coming. They don't prepare for what you're capable of. And when the moment arrives, when lives are on the line and real expertise is needed, you can show them exactly who you've been all along." As the stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Madison thought about the young woman who'd entered the Steel Storm program with dreams of touching the clouds. That woman had been grounded by circumstances beyond her control, but she'd found a different way to fly. She'd learned that there were many ways to serve, many paths to excellence, and many opportunities to make a difference. The nickname that had once been a cruel joke now seemed almost prophetic. Benchwarmer Barbie sitting quietly, watching, learning, preparing for the moment when her skills would be needed most. They'd meant it as an insult, but Madison had transformed it into something else entirely, a reminder that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones you dismissed too quickly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and new chances to protect the sailors who served alongside her. But tonight, Madison Lin, Chief Petty Officer Lin, soon-to-be Division Director Lin, was exactly where she belonged, serving her country, using her talents, and proving that sometimes the quiet ones were the ones you should never underestimate. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, full of possibilities she was finally free to explore. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.